The morning sunlight broke over the small town, spilling golden light across the cobblestone streets and reflecting off the modest stone walls of the convent where Sister Magdalene had spent the better part of her adult life. At 55, her life was one of discipline, devotion, and isolation, yet outwardly she carried an aura of quiet authority that drew the admiration and sometimes envy of everyone who knew her. For decades, she had walked the narrow line between piety and power, moving with the measured grace of someone who knew her place in the world and expected the world to recognize her sanctity. To the townsfolk, Sister Magdalene was a figure of moral certainty, a living embodiment of the divine calling, a woman whose commitment to God appeared unshakable. Every morning, she would rise before dawn, her thin frame cloaked in the plain habit of her order, and kneel in silent prayer. Her eyes, sharp and penetrating even beneath the veil of her wimple, seemed to see not just the visible world, but the hidden motives of those around her. She was respected, feared, and, in some quiet corners of the town, even revered as a local saint. The convent itself was a place of quiet order and ritual. Its stone corridors echoed with the soft footfalls of nuns moving about their duties, from preparing meals to tending the small vegetable garden that supplied the convent's modest kitchen. Candles flickered in the chapel, throwing long shadows across the carved pews, and the faint scent of incense hung in the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of the monastery's ancient stone walls. Sister Magdalene walked these corridors with an almost imperceptible authority, issuing instructions to the younger nuns with a voice that was soft but uncompromising. They obeyed her without question, not merely out of respect for her rank, but out of a deep-seated awe for the intensity of her devotion. In her presence, their chatter would die down, their hands would steady, and a hushed reverence would settle over the room. She was, in every sense, the embodiment of the convent's moral compass, and for many, a living example of what it meant to dedicate oneself entirely to God. Despite this exterior of unwavering faith, Magdalene's life was far from simple. She had spent decades buried in routines so strict that even the smallest deviation felt like a betrayal of her calling. Meals were taken in silence, prayers recited in exact order, and every action, no matter how mundane, was meant to be a testament to her devotion. Yet, beneath the surface of ritual and order, there was a quiet loneliness, a sense of isolation that had deepened with each passing year. At 55, she had seen generations of nuns come and go, watched students grow into women and leave the convent for marriage or work, and observed the world outside her stone walls shift and change, while her own life remained largely static. There were moments, rare, fleeting, and quickly suppressed, when she wondered if her piety had come at too great a cost. The questions never spoke themselves aloud; she would not have permitted it. But late at night, when the convent was silent and her own prayers had been said, Magdalene sometimes felt a pang of yearning, a whisper of what life might have been if she had walked a different path. Her reputation in the town was impeccable. Villagers would tell newcomers about the nun who had devoted herself entirely to God, who had healed the sick with simple remedies, and who had comforted the dying with words that seemed to come straight from heaven. Her counsel was sought in matters both spiritual and mundane. She could calm a quarrel between neighbors as deftly as she could guide a soul back to the fold. Yet this very perfection, this almost too perfect devotion, cast a long shadow. It made her seem untouchable, above the petty temptations and frailties that afflicted ordinary people. Parents would bring their children to the convent, believing that a blessing from Sister Magdalene could shield them from misfortune. Merchants and town officials would consult her before making decisions, hoping that her wisdom might guide them. Even those who did not believe in God found themselves admiring her discipline, wondering how a woman could live so completely unselfishly day after day, year after year. Her life was a paradox, wholly devoted, yet profoundly lonely, outwardly admired, yet inwardly isolated, a symbol of holiness, yet quietly human in ways no one dared acknowledge. The convent itself became an extension of her presence, reflecting the meticulous care she poured into every corner of its existence. Gardens were trimmed with precision, herbs for healing meticulously cultivated, and the library of religious texts organized to the letter. Sister Magdalene would spend hours in the scriptorium, copying prayers and meditating over illuminated manuscripts, her quill moving in deliberate strokes across the parchment. The younger nuns would often watch her in silence, inspired by the devotion she displayed, but unaware of the subtle restlessness beneath the surface of her calm. She had grown skilled at hiding her emotions, at presenting the flawless exterior expected of someone in her position. To the world, she was untouchable. To herself, she was quietly yearning for something she could not name, a longing she had long convinced herself was sinful, unholy, and therefore unattainable. There was also a sharp intelligence that underpinned her devotion, a cunning that Faye W. could perceive behind her serene exterior. Sister Magdalene was not merely following the rules of her order, she understood them, manipulated them when necessary, and wielded them to maintain control. She was a master of perception, knowing which gestures would reassure her peers and which words would command respect. In sermons, she spoke with a quiet authority that carried far beyond the chapel walls, weaving scripture with subtle suggestions that left listeners both edified and slightly unsettled. Even the abbess, her superior, recognized that Magdalene possessed a rare combination of piety and influence, a force that could not easily be restrained. And yet, for all her power within the convent, there remained a world outside she could not command, a world where desire, temptation, and human weakness existed beyond the reach of prayer or ritual. It was in this carefully controlled life that the unexpected would arrive. The stage was set for an event so extraordinary, so forbidden, that it would challenge everything the town and convent had believed about Sister Magdalene. But in these quiet, measured days before the scandal, she moved through her life with the steady grace of someone untouched by chaos, someone whose every action reflected years of discipline and faith. Her morning prayers were recited with the precision of a metronome, her meals consumed in silent contemplation, and her instructions to the younger nuns delivered with unwavering calm. Yet beneath the face of her serene routine, the winds of change had begun to stir, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A new presence would enter her life, one that would shatter the illusion of perfection and thrust her into a story that history would remember as scandalous, controversial, and utterly shocking. Sister Magdalene, unaware of the approaching storm, continued to walk the convent's corridors with the quiet dignity that had defined her life. She passed the stone fountain in the courtyard, watching the water glint in the morning light, reflecting her own composed image. To any casual observer, she seemed the very embodiment of holiness, unyielding, disciplined, untouchable. Yet, as the shadows of the convent stretched long with the rising sun, there was a subtle tension in her steps, a hint of something waiting beneath the surface. The convent had been her world, her sanctuary, her cage, and now, unbeknownst to her, it was about to become the stage for a story that would test the boundaries of faith, morality, and human desire in ways no one could have anticipated. The first time he appeared on the convent grounds, he was just a shadow among the morning mist, a young man whose presence seemed almost too bold for the quiet, disciplined world of Sister Magdalene. He was introduced as a servant brought by the nearby estate to assist with the laborious chores that the nuns could not manage themselves. He carried himself with an air of both fear and defiance, as though he had learned early in life that submission was necessary for survival, yet pride could not be entirely erased. His name was Elias, and he was barely 20, with skin darkened by the sun and muscles honed by years of hard work. His eyes, however, revealed a depth that belied his youth, a mixture of curiosity, cunning, and a quiet intensity that drew people in, whether they wanted to be drawn or not. From the very first day, Sister Magdalene noticed him, not in the obvious casual way, but with the subtle attention that came from years of observing the world with a near supernatural acuity. There was something about him that unsettled her, something that tugged at the edges of the carefully maintained boundaries she had built around herself. He was tasked with tending the gardens and assisting in the maintenance of the convent's small workshops, but his work was not what captured her attention. It was his presence, the way he moved through the space with both deference and quiet assertion, the way his gaze occasionally lingered a little too long. the way he seemed to understand, more than he should, about the inner workings of a life devoted to God. The early days were subtle, almost imperceptible. Sister Magdalene observed him as he carried baskets of vegetables, mended fences, and cleaned the stone floors, always moving with a diligence that was both impressive and frustrating. He spoke little, responding to her instructions with curt nods or brief acknowledgments, and yet there was a magnetic pull in the way he held himself, a tension that seemed to vibrate in the very air whenever he was near. She found herself, for the first time in decades, aware of the rhythm of another human being, conscious of his breathing, the movement of his hands, the tilt of his head. In the quiet moments of the day, when the other nuns were occupied with prayer or chores, she would catch sight of him from across the courtyard and feel a stirring that was both thrilling and terrifying. Elias, for his part, was equally observant. He quickly realized that the nun who commanded respect with a quiet word or a glance was not merely a figure of authority, she was a force to be reckoned with. He approached his duties with caution, learning the limits of her patience and the boundaries of her expectations. Yet beneath his obedience, there was a spark of audacity. He was young, aware of his own vitality and charm, and possessed an intuitive sense of how to navigate the rigid world into which he had been thrust. He noticed the fleeting moments when her gaze lingered on him, the subtle adjustments she made to maintain her composure when he was near, the almost imperceptible shift in her posture when she spoke to him. There was a game unfolding between them, silent and unspoken, a dangerous dance on the edge of propriety that neither dared acknowledge outright. As the days turned into weeks, their interactions grew bolder, though still cloaked in the guise of necessity and routine. He would bring her herbs from the garden, his hands brushing hers ever so slightly, sending a jolt of awareness through her that she could not easily dismiss. He would pause in conversation, allowing his voice to linger on her name just a fraction longer than appropriate, making her heart race in a way that she could neither control nor comprehend. For Sister Magdalene, these moments were both intoxicating and horrifying. She had spent decades building a life of discipline, denying the most basic desires of the flesh, and yet here was a young man whose very existence seemed to defy all her carefully constructed rules. The convent, once a sanctuary of order and faith, was beginning to feel like a cage lined with temptation. Elias, too, was aware of the danger. He had grown up understanding the delicate balance between survival and desire, the ways in which power could be leveraged and boundaries could be tested. He did not see Sister Magdalene merely as a figure of authority. He saw her as a woman, vulnerable in ways that were hidden beneath the layers of habit and devotion. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a tension that was palpable in the stolen glances, the almost accidental touches, the moments when words were unnecessary because the air itself seemed charged with meaning. Each day they edged closer to a boundary neither dared cross openly, yet the pull between them was undeniable. It was in these quiet, charged moments that the first seeds of the scandal were planted. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the convent's gardens were bathed in golden light, Elias brought a basket of freshly picked herbs to Sister Magdalene. Their hands brushed fleetingly, and she felt an electric shock that left her breathless. She looked into his eyes and saw a reflection of her own suppressed longing mirrored back at her with unnerving clarity. For a moment, the world outside the convent ceased to exist. There were no rules, no rituals, no expectations, only the raw, undeniable pull between two human beings who had been brought together by fate, circumstance, and perhaps something far more mysterious. From that moment on, their interactions grew more intimate in ways that could not be fully articulated. They would linger in the garden after the others had gone inside, ostensibly discussing the care of the plants. Yet the conversation was laden with double meanings and subtle innuendo. Elias would ask questions about her life, her faith, her dreams, and she would respond with measured honesty, revealing glimpses of herself she had long kept hidden. The young man's presence stirred something within her that she had not felt in decades, a sense of vitality, desire, and connection that went beyond the boundaries of convent life. For the first time, she realized that her carefully constructed world of discipline and devotion could not contain the complexity of human emotion. The convent walls, which had once seemed protective, now felt oppressive. Every glance, every gesture, every accidental touch between them became loaded with meaning. Sister Magdalene found herself praying more fervently, not to quell the desire, but to understand it, to make sense of the forbidden emotions that had been awakened within her. She walked the stone corridors with her heart racing, acutely aware of his presence even when he was not in the room. The young man's shadow seemed to follow her, a constant reminder that the life she had built could no longer protect her from the turbulence of human passion. Elias, for his part, was both intrigued and cautious. He had learned to read people quickly, to sense the boundaries that could not be crossed without danger. He recognized the power imbalance between them, the moral and social chasm that separated a nun from a young servant, and yet he also sensed the vulnerability beneath her rigid exterior. There was a magnetism in Sister Magdalene, a force that drew him in despite the risk. Each interaction was a careful negotiation, a delicate balance between desire and restraint, and yet neither could resist the gravity pulling them closer together. The town outside remained oblivious to the subtle but dangerous bond forming within the convent walls. To the villagers, Elias was merely a young servant, and Sister Magdalene was the same devout nun they had always known. No one could have guessed that behind the veils, behind the disciplined routines and silent prayers, a story was unfolding. That would one day shock the world. Their interactions were like whispers in the dark, moments of intimacy hidden beneath layers of propriety, each one a thread in a tapestry of tension that neither dared fully acknowledge. And so, life at the convent began to shift imperceptibly. The gardens were tended with more care, the meals prepared with a subtle awareness of shared glances, and the quiet corridors echoed with a tension that was both thrilling and dangerous. Sister Magdalene felt the stirrings of desire that she had long repressed, emotions she had convinced herself were sinful and forbidden. Yet with Elias, those feelings were mirrored, amplified, and rendered almost impossible to deny. The convent, once a bastion of discipline and faith, had become a crucible for temptation, a stage on which the forces of desire and morality would collide in ways that neither of them could foresee. As the weeks passed, the bond between them deepened, though still unspoken and cloaked in the guise of necessity and routine. Each small interaction, whether a brush of hands, a shared glance, or a conversation about the garden, was charged with meaning. The tension between duty and desire, between devotion and passion, grew more pronounced, shaping every action they took. The young servant, who had arrived as an outsider to perform menial tasks, had become a catalyst for change in a life that had been carefully controlled for decades. And Sister Magdalene, who had believed herself untold, was slowly awakening to the complexities of human emotion, realizing that the strict boundaries of convent life could not contain the force that had entered her world. It was in these moments, quiet yet charged with unspoken longing, that the first true crack in the convent's veneer appeared. The young servant and the devout nun were dancing on the edge of propriety, aware of the danger but unable to resist the pull. Each day brought new moments of tension, new interactions that carried the weight of forbidden desire, and a sense that the ordinary rhythms of convent life could no longer protect them from what was coming. The stage was set, the players in place, and the world beyond the convent walls remained unaware that history itself was being quietly rewritten in the shadow of stone walls and sacred vows. The scandal began in whispers, as all great shocks do, small murmurs that crept from one corner of the town to the next, like smoke slowly curling through a chimney before bursting into flame. It started with subtle observations, a servant staying too long in the garden, the nun lingering near the sunlight filtering through the chapel windows, shadows cast in ways that suggested more than work or devotion. People began noticing the way Sister Magdalene's gaze would soften in his presence, how she sometimes seemed distracted during prayer, her thoughts elsewhere. The townsfolk were puzzled at first, reluctant to believe that the holy nun they revered could be anything but perfect. But as rumors gathered momentum, carried by the tongues of those who had always hungered for scandal, the impossible truth began to take shape. The devout 55-year-old nun, whose life had been a paragon of piety, was pregnant. At first, the convent itself was a place of denial. Sister Magdalene continued her routine with outward composure, kneeling in the chapel, instructing the younger nuns, and attending to her duties with the exactitude that had defined her life for decades. But the subtle changes were undeniable to those closest to her. Her habit, once crisp and tightly cinched, now strained slightly at the abdomen. Her mornings, once spent in silent meditation, were now punctuated by moments of fatigue, her hands trembling as she held the prayer book. She moved through the corridors with the grace of a dancer masking a stumble, hiding the secret of a life that had defied expectation and morality. The younger nuns sensed the difference, though none dared speak of it openly. The convent walls, once a fortress of discipline, were now a stage for a drama that had no script. The townspeople, ever observant, began to whisper openly. As the signs became impossible to ignore, mothers would glance at their children during Mass, questioning if the rumors were true. Merchants who had come to the convent to seek Sister Magdalene's counsel noticed a subtle change in her posture, the way she sometimes held herself with an almost imperceptible tension. In shed tones, they speculated about what could have caused such an anomaly, their minds grappling with the impossible, a nun devoted entirely to God, pregnant at 55. And then came the confirmation, a moment that would ignite the scandal in full. A visiting priest, sent to examine Sister Magdalene for reasons he would later claim were purely medical, left the convent with a look of grave astonishment, spreading the news in tones too measured to be ignored. As word reached the broader community, the reaction was electric, a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and morbid fascination. The story spread faster than wildfire, carried by market gossipers, passing travelers, and the ever-curious children who delighted in the notion of the impossible. Soon, every household knew of the nun's condition, and the town was divided between those who insisted it was a divine miracle and those who whispered accusations of sin and impropriety. In the streets, people would stop mid-conversation to exchange knowing glances, their eyes reflecting the turmoil of judgment and wonder. The impossible had entered their lives, and no amount of pious explanation could contain it. Inside the convent, Sister Magdalene faced a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she clung to the explanation that she had told herself from the moment the impossibility became apparent, that this was God's will, a miracle beyond human comprehension, a sign of divine favor. She spoke of it in prayers, kneeling before the altar and whispering words that only she could understand, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear, awe, and defiance. To her, the pregnancy was a testament not to human weakness, but to God's mysterious power, a sign that faith could transcend the limits of flesh and time. On the other hand, she could not entirely ignore the truth that had crept into her life, the role of the young servant Elias, whose presence had awakened desires she had long denied. In private moments, her mind would replay their interactions, the subtle touches, the stolen glances, the quiet intimacy that had drawn them together like moths to a flame. The line between sin and sanctity blurred, leaving her in a liminal space where devotion and desire collided. Elias, too, found himself in uncharted territory. The young man had come to the convent as a servant, his role clearly defined by social hierarchy and expectation. But now, the weight of the scandal pressed upon him in ways he had never imagined. He could see the judgmental eyes of the townspeople, the whispers that followed him as he moved through the streets, and he understood that he had become both a participant and a target. Yet he was also keenly aware of the power he held over Sister Magdalene, the influence his presence had on her emotions, and the impossible sway he had over the course of her life. Each day, he navigated a dangerous path, balancing the human desire that had been ignited with the consequences that loomed ever larger. The scandal did not remain confined to the town for long. Letters were sent to the church authorities, reporting the situation in tones that ranged from incredulity to moral outrage. The abbess, upon receiving word, dispatched envoys to investigate, their faces grim and expressions unreadable as they approached the convent gates. These envoys arrived under the guise of concern for Sister Magdalene's health, yet their true purpose was to determine the nature of the scandal and its implications for the Church's reputation. Within the stone walls of the convent, the tension was palpable. Sister Magdalene met them with a calmness that belied the storm raging within, speaking in measured tones of divine intervention and miraculous occurrences, while the envoys observed every movement, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion. The confrontation was inevitable. In a private chamber, away from the eyes of the younger nuns, Sister Magdalene faced the senior envoys. Their questions were direct, their voices sharp, yet she responded with the practiced serenity of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of composure. She spoke of God's miracle, of faith transcending the human limitations of age and expectation, of the unfathomable ways in which divine will manifested. She did not deny the circumstances, nor did she attempt to conceal the truth of her body's condition, but she framed it entirely in the language of devotion, turning potential condemnation into an assertion of holiness. The envoys left with heavy hearts and troubled minds, aware that the story would be impossible to contain and that the line between sanctity and scandal had become irreversibly blurred. Meanwhile, the community's reaction intensified. Crowds gathered outside the convent gates, some seeking blessings, others driven by curiosity, and still others by a sense of righteous indignation. Each visit, each whispered rumor, and each pointed glance became a reminder that the private transgression had become public spectacle. Newspapers of the time, or their equivalent in town record keepers, recorded the event with a mixture of sensationalism and moral outrage, ensuring that the story would reach far beyond the immediate vicinity. The nun who had been untouchable, who had embodied moral perfection, was now the subject of scrutiny, gossip, and debate. Her every action was interpreted, misinterpreted, and debated, leaving her existence suspended between reverence and revulsion. For Sister Magdalene, the experience was both humiliating and empowering. On one hand, she faced public scrutiny, the judgment of her peers, and the moral condemnation of the broader church. On the other hand, she had claimed a narrative for herself, framing the impossible as divine intervention, a miracle that elevated her story beyond mere human scandal. She began to see the power in shaping perception, in using faith and eloquence to defend not only her choices, but also the very essence of her being. L.I.S. remained close, a quiet presence who both emboldened and grounded her, and together they navigated the treacherous waters of rumor, judgment, and revelation. The pregnancy progressed, each passing week adding fuel to the fire. Townspeople whispered of the growing miracle, debating whether this was truly a sign from God or a moral failing dressed in the language of faith. The convent, once a place of solemn quiet, became a focal point for intrigue, prayer, gossip, and debate. Visitors came from miles away, seeking either to witness the miracle or to admonish the supposed sinner. The once orderly life of Sister Magdalene had been transformed into a tableau of tension, desire, and social upheaval where every glance, every gesture, every interaction carried the weight of public attention and private longing. And yet, despite the judgment, the scandal, and the impossible circumstances, there was a sense of inevitability about it all. The threads that had been laid in the quiet gardens, in the stolen glances, and in the subtle touches had led inexorably to this moment. The nun and the young servant were caught in a storm of their own making, yet one that felt preordained, as if the forces of human desire, societal expectation, and divine intervention had conspired together. The town watched, the church observed, and history waited, all bearing witness to an event that would be remembered not only for its scandalous nature, but for the way it exposed the fragility of human morality, the power of perception, and the unpredictable intersection of faith and desire. As the months passed, the scandal showed no signs of abating. Letters continued to arrive, envoys continued to visit, and the townspeople continued to gossip. Yet through it all, Sister Magdalene maintained a composure that was almost otherworldly, speaking of God's will and miraculous intervention while navigating the impossible human realities that had been thrust upon her. Elias remained at her side, both a participant in the unfolding drama and a witness to the extraordinary events that were reshaping lives and reputations. Together, they had become living symbols of contradiction, holiness and sin, devotion and desire, scandal and sanctity, all intertwined in a story that no one could have imagined and few would ever forget. The consequences of the scandal descended on Sister Magdalene like a storm, sudden and unrelenting, leaving no aspect of her life untouched. Once the whispers became shouts and rumors transformed into undeniable fact, the convent could no longer shield her. The walls that had protected decades of disciplined devotion and hidden longing were now permeable, allowing the judgment, curiosity, and outrage of the outside world to seep into every corridor. Townspeople, once respectful and deferential, now approached the convent with a mixture of fascination and contempt. They were eager to witness the impossible, to see with their own eyes the nun who had defied the Natu. Real order of life and faith. Some came with reverence, convinced that a miracle had occurred. Others came with righteous indignation, determined to confront what they saw as blasphemy incarnate. The balance that Sister Magdalene had once maintained between the sanctuary of the convent and the scrutiny of the town was shattered, leaving her exposed in ways she had never imagined. The Church's response was swift and severe. Letters sent to higher authorities had triggered inquiries, and soon envoys arrived from the diocese to investigate the nature of the pregnancy, the role of the young servant, and the moral implications for the convent itself. They were men of stern countenance, trained to observe, to judge, and to act decisively in situations that threatened the reputation of the Church. When they entered the convent gates, they were met with the quiet, controlled presence of Sister Magdalene, whose composure masked the internal storm that had been building since the first whispers began. She spoke of divine intervention, of miracles that transcended human understanding, of faith so powerful it could override the limitations of the flesh. Yet even her eloquence, honed over decades of devotion, could not entirely obscure the scandal that was unfolding before them. The envoys demanded access to all areas of the convent, to the nuns, to the records, and to Sister Magdalene herself. Each interrogation, each probing question, felt like a dagger to her carefully maintained image. She answered with measured calm, insisting that her pregnancy was a sign from God, a miracle of divine will. But their expressions betrayed skepticism, and subtle gestures, a frown, a raised eyebrow, the tapping of a finger, revealed their disbelief. They questioned the young servant Elias, whose presence in the convent had once been unremarkable, now a focal point of suspicion and moral inquiry. He spoke sparingly, carefully choosing words that neither incriminated himself nor insulted Sister Magdalene. Yet even his restraint could not prevent judgment from being passed. The Church had already decided that the situation was scandalous, and their inquiry was as much about control and reputation as it was about truth. The social consequences were equally unforgiving. Families who had once sought Sister Magdalene's counsel turned away, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Mothers warned their daughters against entering the convent, and parishioners debated whether to continue attending services where the nun, now pregnant, was a visible figure of contradiction. The townspeople's fascination bordered on obsession. Crowds gathered outside the convent walls, craning to see what had once been considered sacred. The air was thick with anticipation, with a mixture of judgment, curiosity, and moral outrage. Conversations in the marketplace, at taverns, and along the streets revolved entirely around the scandal. What had once been private devotion was now a public spectacle. And Sister Magdalene found herself at the center of a storm she had neither invited nor could escape. Within the convent itself, tensions ran high. The younger nuns, who had long admired Sister Magdalene's discipline and wisdom, struggled with conflicting emotions. Some remained loyal, believing in her explanation of divine intervention, willing to defend her to outsiders. Others recoiled, unable to reconcile their own faith with the impossible reality they faced. The atmosphere became strained, every interaction tinged with suspicion, every glance heavy with unspoken questions. The convent, once a place of harmony, became a theatre of tension, where devotion and doubt, reverence and fear collided daily. Sister Magdalene's internal world mirrored this external chaos. Each day brought a new layer of consequence to navigate. She had claimed a narrative for herself, framing the pregnancy as miraculous, yet she could not entirely silence the human recognition of what had occurred between her and Elias. She wrestled with guilt, shame, desire, and defiance, emotions that were impossible to disentangle from the reality imposed upon her. Nights were spent in prayer, but even prayer was a battleground, with whispered confessions and petitions for forgiveness mingled with an unspoken desire for understanding, for acceptance, for a reconciliation of the impossible. Her solitude was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. Each reflection, each breath, each movement was now heavy wit. The knowledge that her life had been irrevocably altered. The young servant Elias experienced consequences of his own. He had entered the convent as an outsider, a worker of little note, yet the pregnancy elevated him to a position of both notoriety and vulnerability. Townspeople scrutinized his every action, questioning his morals, his character, and his intentions. Yet he remained calm, deliberate, aware that any misstep could deepen the scandal and endanger both himself and Sister Magdalene. In private, he became a source of quiet support for the nun, navigating the turbulent waters of judgment alongside her, understanding the precarious position they both occupied. Their bond, forged in the shadow of taboo and temptation, became both a lifeline and a source of tension. Carrying the weight of consequence in every shared glance, every subtle gesture, every private conversation. Even beyond the convent, the ramifications rippled outward. Letters of inquiry reached distant dioceses, conversations at regional councils included references to the miraculous pregnancy, and stories circulated that blurred the line between reality and myth. Some hailed the event as evidence of God's mysterious power, a divine miracle that transcended logic and human understanding. Others decried it as a moral failing, a transgression so severe that it threatened to undermine the sanctity of religious life. The situation became a moral and theological battleground, with Sister Magdalene and Elias at its center. The ordinary rhythms of life in the town and surrounding regions were disrupted. Conversations dominated by scandal, curiosity, and the age-old fascination with the forbidden. The physical consequences were no less intense. Sister Magdalene's body, now bearing life at an age considered impossible, was a source of both awe and concern. Medical professionals, or the closest equivalents of the time, examined her discreetly, documenting the progression of the pregnancy, marveling at the improbability of the event. She experienced fatigue, discomfort, and pain that reminded her of her humanity, of the reality she could not escape. The convent, already tense with rumor and judgment, now became a place of care and observation, with nuns attending to her needs, some with devotion, others with quiet fear. Elias assisted where he could, his hands steady, his presence a constant reassurance amid the storm, yet the weight of public scrutiny never left him. The emotional toll on the community was profound. Families debated morality and faith, questioning the nature of miracles, sin, and divine intervention. Scholars, theologians, and moralists dissected every detail, interpreting the event to suit their own beliefs, their own agendas. Some saw in Sister Magdalene a model of unwavering faith, a vessel through which God's will manifested in ways humans could barely comprehend. Others saw scandal, corruption, and a betrayal of trust, using her story to warn others about the dangers of desire and temptation. The story became a mirror for the community's fears, hopes, and contradictions, a touchstone for conversations that had no easy resolution. Amidst the public scrutiny and private chaos, Sister Magdalene began to understand the true scope of consequence. It was not only her body or her reputation at stake, it was the delicate fabric of the convent, the faith of the younger nuns, and the perception of holiness within the community. Every action she took now carried immense weight, every decision shaped by the dual pressures of divine explanation and human judgment. She became a strategist as much as a devotee, navigating letters, visitors, inquiries, and gossip with careful precision. Yet even her skillful management could not shield her from the most painful consequences. The isolation that came from being judged, the knowledge that her choices were scrutinized more harshly than any ordinary person's, the bitter awareness that her life had become a spectacle of morality and scandal alike. Elias, too, felt the crushing weight of consequence. His youth, his beauty, and his role as a servant no longer defined him. He was now central to a narrative that combined desire, taboo, and divine mystery. He walked carefully among the townspeople, aware that their gazes were heavy with suspicion, admiration, and envy. Within the convent, he remained close to Sister Magdalene, a silent partner in navigating the storm, yet the consequences extended beyond them both. Their bond was a secret that could not remain hidden forever, a tension that would shape the events of the months to come, influencing the choices of church authorities, townspeople, and even the younger nuns who looked to Magdalene for guidance. As the pregnancy progressed, the consequences only deepened. Every step she took, every word she spoke, every prayer she whispered, carried the weight of judgment. The convent became a theatre of observation, with nuns, townspeople, and church envoys all watching, all interpreting, all waiting for something to shift. The impossible had become reality, and reality had consequences that could not be ignored. Sister Magdalene and Elias had ignited a chain of events that touched every corner of their lives, reshaping faith, morality, and perception in ways that would be remembered for generations. Yet through all of this, a quiet resilience emerged. Sister Magdalene, who had once been defined solely by devotion and discipline, now found a deeper understanding of herself, of human desire, and of the unpredictable intersection of faith and reality. Elias, too, discovered the weight and complexity of human responsibility, the burden of navigating scandal while remaining true to one's convictions. Together, they faced the consequences not merely as victims of circumstance, but as actors in a story that had no precedent. A story where scandal, desire, and faith collided in ways that demanded courage, cunning, and profound self-awareness. And so the consequences of the scandal were felt in every dimension, socially, morally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. The town's perception of holiness and sin was forever altered, the convent's atmosphere transformed, and the lives of everyone involved, Sister Magdalene, Elias, the nuns, the townspeople, and church authorities, redefined by the events that had unfolded. The world had been forced to confront the impossible, and the reverberations of that confrontation would echo far beyond the stone walls of the convent, shaping the story of faith, desire, and scandal for generations to come. Time, that relentless arbiter of memory, began to wash over the events of the scandal, softening some edges while sharpening others. Sister Magdalene's pregnancy, which had once ignited shock, outrage, and fascination, now settled into the consciousness of the town and the broader region as a story that could not be forgotten. Even decades later, whispers of what had transpired in that convent circulated among parishioners, in town markets, and in letters passed discreetly between clergy and laypeople alike. The scandal had become legend, a tale that teetered between disbelief and moral warning, between fascination with the impossible and reflection on human nature. It was remembered not merely for the improbability of a 55-year-old nun bearing a child, but for the collision of faith, desire, authority, and secrecy that had produced a story both impossible and unforgettable. The convent, which had been the epicenter of the storm, gradually returned to its routines, though it was forever changed. Younger nuns who had once looked up to Sister Magdalene with unquestioning admiration were forced to reconcile their reverence with the undeniable reality of human complexity. Some left the convent, unable to bear the tension and moral ambiguity that lingered in the air, seeking solace elsewhere. Others remained, their loyalty tempered by the lessons of scandal. their devotion now tempered by the realization that holiness and human imperfection were not mutually exclusive. The daily rituals continued, the prayers, the meals, the work in the gardens, but every stone, every corridor, every flicker of candlelight seemed to carry a shadow of the past, a reminder that the human heart could defy expectation in ways both divine and dangerous. Sister Magdalene herself became a figure of paradox. To some, she was a saint, chosen by God to demonstrate the miraculous power of divine will, a woman whose devotion had somehow attracted and contained the inexplicable. To others, she was a cautionary tale, a woman who had allowed desire to infiltrate a life that had once been defined by discipline and piety. She embraced both identities with a quiet strength, understanding that the world would never fully categorize her and that her story existed in the liminal space between reverence and reproach. She continued her prayers, her work, and her guidance of the remaining nuns, yet there was an unspoken recognition that her life had been forever altered. The convent, and perhaps even the world around it, would measure holiness against her example for generations, wrestling with the contradictions she embodied. Elias, the young servant who had been at the center of the scandal, also carried the weight of legacy. He had been swept into a story far larger than himself, a story that combined desire, taboo, and the inexplicable. Unlike Sister Magdalene, he was not cloaked in authority or venerated for decades of devotion, yet his role in the narrative was crucial, both as participant and witness, and the way he navigated his own reputation became a defining element of his life. Some saw him as a villain, exploiting a vulnerable woman for his own desires. Others saw him as a hero of sorts, a young man whose presence had awakened passion and change in a life otherwise defined by ritual and isolation. The truth, as always, existed in nuance. Elias was both complicit and innocent, both admired and vilified, a human thread woven into a tapestry of scandal and divinity. The broader society, too, could not easily forget the event. Letters documenting the pregnancy circulated among clergy and scholars, some praising the miracle, others denouncing what they perceived as corruption. Religious debates raged quietly behind closed doors, considering whether divine intervention could truly manifest through such extraordinary means, or whether human weakness had masqueraded as faith. Moralists used the story as a parable, a warning about the dangers of desire, the fragility of virtue, and the unpredictable consequences of temptation. Meanwhile, ordinary people told the story with a mix of awe and amusement, embellishing details over time, blurring lines between fact and fiction. Sister Magdalene's story became a mirror, reflecting the contradictions, anxieties, and fascination of human society, the simultaneous attraction to the miraculous and the forbidden, the tension between judgment and empathy, the thrill of moral spectacle. Over time, historians and chroniclers began to examine the event with more nuanced. Scholars analyzed church records, personal letters, and contemporary accounts, attempting to reconcile the contradictory narratives of divine miracle and human scandal. Some argued that the pregnancy could indeed have been a biological anomaly, a rare and inexplicable event that defied natural law. Others insisted that it was a story constructed, consciously or unconsciously, to reinforce faith in divine intervention, a narrative framed in language of miracle and morality to guide the faithful. Still others focused on the power dynamics at play, a young servant and a powerful woman navigating societal boundaries, exploiting or succumbing to desire, and challenging the rigid hierarchies of the time. Every interpretation added layers of complexity to a story that was already extraordinary, reinforcing its endurance as a subject of fascination, moral inquiry, and historical curiosity. Sister Magdalene herself became both subject and author of her legacy. She spoke sparingly of the events in later years, careful to frame her narrative within the context of faith and divine will. To the outside world, she emphasized the miraculous, the inexplicable, and the sacred, ensuring that her story remained intertwined with reverence rather than judgment. Yet in private, she acknowledged the human elements, the desires and choices that had brought her to that moment, understanding that her legacy was as much a testament to human complexity as it was to divine mystery. She nurtured the child, a living embodiment of the impossible, with care and devotion, teaching lessons of morality, resilience, and the intertwining of human and divine in ways that only someone who had lived through such an extraordinary event could impart. The child, born amidst the storm of scandal, became a symbol of contradiction and hope. To some, the child represented God's miraculous power, a tangible proof that faith could transcend human limitations. To others, the child embodied the transgression, a reminder of the unpredictable consequences of desire and human frailty. The child's life, like Sister Magdalene's, was shaped by perception and narrative, a constant balancing act between reverence and scrutiny, expectation and individuality. The convent and the surrounding town adjusted to this new reality, integrating the child into daily life while remaining acutely aware of the legacy that had produced them. Every milestone, every birthday, every interaction carried the weight of history, of scandal, and of the ongoing debate over morality and miracle. Even centuries later, the story of Sister Magdalene and Elias continues to captivate. It is told in hushed tones in religious discussions, recounted with fascination in history books, and dramatized in art, literature, and modern media. The tale endures because it touches on universal themes, the tension between faith and desire, the unpredictability of human behavior, the fragility of reputation, and the awe-inspiring possibility of the impossible. It challenges assumptions, provokes debate, and invites reflection, forcing audiences to grapple with questions that have no simple answers. Was it a miracle, a moral lapse, or something in between? Could human desire coexist with sanctity? And what does it mean for a life defined by devotion to confront events that are both extraordinary and transgressive? Sister Magdalene's legacy is ultimately one of complexity. She is remembered not only for the miraculous pregnancy that shocked the town and scandalized the church, but also for the grace, resilience, and intelligence with which she navigated the storm. She embodies the contradictions of human life, faith and doubt, devotion and desire, scandal and sanctity. Her story invites empathy and judgment in equal measure, offering a lens through which to explore the nature of morality, the power of perception, and the unpredictable intersection of the divine and the human. She is a figure who cannot be easily categorized, whose life and choices challenge simplistic notions of right and wrong, and whose story continues to resonate precisely because it defies easy explanation. Elias, too, remains an integral part of the legacy. His presence, once merely that of a servant, now carries symbolic weight, representing the unpredictable forces of human connection and desire that intersect with structure, authority, and faith. His role reminds observers that history is rarely composed solely of saints or sinners, but of human beings navigating circumstance, morality, and emotion in ways that are often messy, contradictory, and deeply compelling. Together, he and Sister Magdalene created a story that transcends time, a narrative that is as much about the human condition as it is about the miraculous. The scandal, its consequences, and its enduring legacy also provoke broader reflection on societal values. It exposes the rigid hierarchies of gender, age, and power, the ways in which human beings impose moral frameworks on complex situations, and the fascination society has with transgression and redemption. It also highlights the enduring tension between the sacred and the profane, the human and the divine, and the ways in which stories of impossibility, miraculous or scandalous, shape perception, memory, and morality across generations. While retelling, every interpretation adds a new layer to the legacy, ensuring that the story of Sister Magdalene, Elias, and the miraculous pregnancy remains alive in both imagination and discourse. In the final analysis, the scandal, the consequences, and the legacy converge to create a narrative that is timeless and unforgettable. Sister Magdalene's life, once defined by routine and devotion, became a testament to the unpredictable power of human emotion and divine mystery. Elias's presence transformed from service into legend, a reminder of the profound and often dangerous intersections of desire and circumstance. The convent, the town, the church, and history itself were irrevocably shaped by the events that unfolded, creating a story that continues to provoke awe, debate, and contemplation. It is a tale of human complexity, of miraculous possibility, and of the enduring fascination with those moments when the ordinary boundaries of life are shattered, leaving in their wake a legacy that defies explanation and demands reflection. And so the story lives on, a testament to faith, to desire, to scandal, and to the intricate tapestry of human and divine forces that shape lives in ways that are at once astonishing, troubling, and unforgettable. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question assumptions, and to acknowledge that history, morality, and human nature are rarely simple, and that the legacies we inherit are often forged in the crucible of the impossible. Sister Magdalene, Elias, and the child they brought into the world remain enduring symbols of the complex, contradictory, and deeply human forces that shape our understanding of faith, scandal, and the miraculous.